Hey everybody, welcome back to Sip and Talk. I'm Joe. And as always, I'm ready to dive into some seriously juicy info with you all today. It's like we're mixing up a knowledge cocktail here. Strong stuff, but oh, so smooth going down.
And I'm Sunny, your friendly neighborhood fact checker. I'll make sure we get all the ingredients right. Speaking of mixing things up, you know it's always a good blend? Travel whiskey and discovering awesome new things. You have to check out our friend Mickey's YouTube channel, Mickey to Life.
Yeah, Mickey's the best. He's always got something cool going on.
Good afternoon and good evening, no matter what time zone you are tuning in from today. Welcome to Sip and Talk.
It is so great to be here.
It really is. I mean, it's Sunday, March 8th, 2026, and I was just looking out the window today. The sun is actually shining, my coffee is hitting perfectly, and we have an incredible discussion mapped out for you all today. So welcome, all you Sip and Talkers out there.
Grab your coffee or tea or whatever gets you going, because we have a really dense, highly relevant agenda to get through today.
Oh, absolutely. So before we hit record, we were actually just having this casual chat about kind of the general atmospheric pressure of navigating life lately.
Yeah, the pressure is definitely up there.
Right. And I have to ask you, the listeners sitting at home, or maybe you're driving or walking the dog, have you noticed that the world lately feels like we are all logged into some ridiculously high difficulty, entirely random video game?
That is a very accurate way to describe the current macro environment.
I mean, just looking at the data over the past few weeks, the volatility is staggering. We are watching energy prices skyrocket in ways that, make you actually wince at the gas pump.
The pain is very real.
It is. And then we have major global shipping lanes getting blocked practically overnight, which immediately triggers these massive supply chain domino effects. And of course, the internet is just this perpetual machine of endless, exhausting arguments about what every single data point actually means.
Well, the sheer volume of information right now, combined with the volatility of the events themselves, it creates a perfect storm for cognitive overload. It's really a completely unprecedented environment for human decision-making.
Which brings me to the paradox that I honestly find most fascinating. Have you noticed that two highly credentialed, brilliant experts can look at the exact same spreadsheet, the exact same raw supply and demand data, and come to polar opposite extreme conclusions?
Yes, happens constantly.
Like, one analyst looks at the board and publishes a paper saying the sky is falling and we're heading for a lost decade. And then the other analyst looks at the identical numbers and says, nope, this is a golden age of opportunity and structural market reform. It is wild to observe.
It really is.
It just makes you wonder how the rest of us are supposed to make sense of anything when the people building the models can't even agree. And I know this directly ties into that concept of noise that you always talk about.
Exactly. That phenomenon you're describing is the defining feature of noise.
Yeah.
And it is a fundamental flaw in how human beings, even the most highly trained experts, process reality.
Right.
So our mission today is not to sit here and try to act as fortune tellers. We are absolutely not going to try and predict where oil prices will settle next month or how these geopolitical shipping crises will permanently resolve.
Let's leave that to the internet arguments.
Exactly. Instead, we are going to explore our own cognitive defenses. We're turning the analytical lens inward. Today, we're unpacking the critical structural difference between two major errors in human judgment: bias and noise.
Two things people mix up all the time.
All the time. From there, we're going to explore the profound psychological necessity of dark humor, the actual science of why we laugh when things get highly volatile.
Which we all desperately need right now.
Yes, we do. And finally, we will break down a highly practical framework called decision hygiene to help you survive and navigate the chaos.
I love that.
So, looking at those experts drawing opposite conclusions from identical data, that is the perfect manifestation of noise. And to understand the mechanics of it, we really need to draw a very clear boundary between bias and noise, utilizing the foundational frameworks established by Daniel Kahneman.
Right, because we usually focus so heavily on bias in our cultural conversations. But Kahneman's later work points to this completely different structural flaw. People tend to hear bias and noise and just, lump them together under the general umbrella of making a mistake.
Yes, they treat them as synonyms.
But mathematically and psychologically, they're completely different mechanisms, right?
They are fundamentally different types of errors. And treating them as the same thing leads to terrible systemic solutions. Let's just start by defining bias. Bias is a systemic error. It is predictable, and crucially, it is directional.
Directional meaning it skews a certain way.
Exactly. Think of a sniper looking through the scope of a high-powered rifle, aiming at a paper target. If the sight on that rifle is misaligned by 2 inches to the left, every single time that sniper pulls the trigger, the bullet's going to hit exactly 2 inches to the left of the bullseye.
Right.
If 10 different snipers use that exact same rifle, they will all miss the target in the exact same direction. That is bias.
So in the real world, like finance or policy, you see this when an analyst has this historical ingrained affinity for a specific tech sector. Regardless of macroeconomic headwinds or broader market trends, their forecasts will systematically and consistently lean overly optimistic toward that sector. The error has a clear, recognizable structure.
Precisely. Which means if I know your bias, I can essentially reverse engineer your prediction. I can adjust my own expectations, knowing you always aim a little to the left.
I just mentally move the target.
Yes. But noise lacks that predictability completely. If bias is the misaligned sight on the sniper rifle, noise is the trembling hand holding the weapon.
Oh, wow, the trembling hand.
It is random variability at scatter. You have absolutely no idea where the bullet's going to go. One shot goes high and to the right, the next goes low and to the left, and the third shot completely misses the paper backing altogether.
So in human judgment, noise is just the unwanted, unpredictable variability in decisions that, by all logical metrics, should be identical.
Exactly. It's the inconsistency that creeps into our brains due to factors that should be completely irrelevant to the objective data in hand. And what makes noise so insidious is that it is often entirely invisible to the person making the decision.
They don't even know their hand is trembling.
Right. They genuinely believe they are applying a rigorous, objective framework, completely unaware that their internal state is dictating the outcome.
Let's translate this into a scenario that I think is universally relatable, just to really show how this trembling hand operates on a daily basis for all of us. Imagine you wake up on a Tuesday morning, the sun is shining, you had an incredible 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep, your commute was completely traffic-free, and your morning coffee tastes exactly right.
A perfect morning.
A perfect morning. You sit at your desk, open your financial news app, and you see the headline. The price of crude oil just hit $90 a barrel. Now, in your elevated, optimistic psychological state, your brain processes this raw data and concludes, wow, this is excellent. This high price point is the perfect economic catalyst for green energy infrastructure. It will force the market to accelerate the transition to renewables. The future of innovation is bright.
Because your cognition is being subtly lubricated by your positive physiological state. You are interpreting the data through a lens of safety and abundance.
Exactly. But now, let's rewind and run a simulation of a different Tuesday. You slept terribly because the neighbor's dog was barking until 3 a.m. You stubbed your toe getting out of bed. Your commute was an absolute nightmare, and the moment you walk into the office, your boss aggressively criticizes you for a mistake that wasn't even yours.
You're completely depleted.
You are so stressed. Your cortisol levels are spiking, your heart rate is elevated. You sit down, open that exact same news app, and see the exact same headline. Oil hits $90 a barrel. Suddenly, your brain looks at those digits and screams, this is a catastrophe. Inflation is going to completely crush the middle class. Consumer spending will halt. We are on the brink of global conflict.
And it is the exact same individual.
Same person, looking at the exact same objective data point, but generating a wildly different macroeconomic judgment simply because their internal weather changed. That is the essence of noise.
That perfectly encapsulates the concept. And what is truly alarming is that we dramatically underestimate how much this happens at the highest levels of professional judgment.
We want to believe the experts are immune.
We do. We operate under this comforting illusion that professionals, institutional experts, and global systems function on pure logic and standardized algorithms. But human judgment is incredibly, profoundly noisy. The data Kahneman and his colleagues uncovered on this is genuinely shocking.
Yeah, we're not just talking about a retail investor's bad morning commute here.
No, we are talking about massive, life-altering inconsistencies embedded deep within major institutions. Let's examine the insurance industry as a prime example. The researchers focused on underwriters.
Right, the people who calculate the premiums.
Exactly. An underwriter's entire professional existence revolves around assessing risk and assigning a precise dollar value to a premium. You would naturally assume this is a highly standardized, actuarial, math-driven process.
You would certainly hope so. I mean, if a business is buying liability insurance, they want to know the premium they are quoted is the result of a rigorous mathematical formula, not the result of whether the underwriter's favorite sports team won their game over the weekend.
Well, the researchers went to the senior executives of a massive globally recognized insurance company and posed a simple question. They asked, if we give two well-trained, highly experienced underwriters the exact same complex case file to evaluate, how much do you expect their final premium assessments to vary?
What did the execs say?
The executives confidently predicted a variance of about 10%. They calculated that there is always a little bit of wiggle room for subjective professional judgment, perhaps differing interpretations of a specific risk clause, but 10% was deemed the acceptable boundary of human variance.
10% sounds entirely reasonable for humans executing a complex task. But knowing the punchline of this research, I have a feeling the executives were incredibly far off. What was the actual measured variance?
The actual median variance was a staggering 55%.
55%. That's not a margin of error. That is an entirely different reality.
It completely destabilizes the concept of institutional consistency. That 55% variance means that one senior underwriter might price a corporate premium at $100,000, and the underwriter sitting at the desk right next to them, looking at the exact same financial documents, the exact same risk profile, might price it at $155,000.
Just randomly.
Completely randomly. And this massive discrepancy is not because one underwriter harbors a systemic bias against the client's industry. It is purely because of noise. It is cognitive fatigue. It is the time of day. It is how recently they took a break, or subtle, completely random differences in how their brain intuitively weights paragraph 3 versus paragraph 4 on that specific morning.
That is genuinely terrifying when you scale it up. It means a company could literally save or lose tens of thousands of dollars just by the sheer luck of whose desk their paperwork happens to land on. And if a math-heavy sector like insurance is plagued by a 55% noise factor, the implications for areas that rely even more on subjective human judgment are incredibly grim.
They are, and the stakes become immeasurably higher when we shift from financial premiums to human freedom. This brings us to what behavioral scientists refer to as judicial roulette.
Judicial roulette. That does not sound good.
It isn't. There was a landmark, highly scrutinized study involving 164 United States judges. These are not amateurs. These are highly educated, deeply experienced legal professionals whose sworn duty is to uphold the law with objective neutrality.
Right.
The researchers constructed a controlled experiment where they gave these 164 judges the exact same hypothetical case file. The defendant's socioeconomic background, the specific details of the crime, the financial damages, the statements from the defense and prosecution. Every single variable was perfectly standardized and controlled.
So the environment is essentially a sterile laboratory for legal decision-making. By controlling all the external variables, you isolate the judge's internal reasoning. You would expect a very tight cluster of sentences, maybe a variance of a few months depending on whether a specific judge leans slightly more toward punitive justice versus rehabilitative justice, which would be a predictable bias.
Right.
But they should all land in the same general ballpark.
You would think so.
Yeah.
But the sentences handed down by these 164 judges for the exact same hypothetical case ranged from a mere slap on the wrist with probation.
Wait, probation?
Probation. All the way up to 10 years in a federal penitentiary.
Probation versus a decade in a cage for the identical crime committed by the identical hypothetical person under identical circumstances.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the trembling hand. And subsequent deeper studies into judicial decision-making have revealed that random biological and environmental factors completely outside the scope of jurisprudence, deeply influence these life-altering outcomes.
Like what kind of factors?
The time of day a parole hearing takes place is a massive statistical indicator of the outcome. A judge is statistically far more likely to grant parole first thing in the morning when they are arrested, or immediately after they have had a good lunch.
You're kidding.
I'm not. If your case is unfortunately scheduled for 11:45 a.m., right before the lunch recess when the judge is experiencing cognitive depletion and low blood sugar, your chances of a favorable ruling absolutely plummet. Your freedom is not being dictated by the scales of justice. It's being dictated by human biology, digestion, and random chance.
Which fundamentally changes how we have to view global leadership right now. Because we started by talking about this pervasive feeling of navigating a chaotic, high-difficulty era in 2026. If highly trained judges and insurance executives are generating this much noise in calm, perfectly controlled environments, what happens to world leaders, central bankers, and policymakers who are operating in the middle of an unprecedented high-stakes global energy crisis?
The pressure cooker of a crisis does not just reveal noise, it dramatically amplifies it. When leaders are dealing with skyrocketing energy costs, blocked maritime shipping lanes, and genuine public panic, their cognitive load is entirely maxed out.
They have to be exhausted.
They're operating under severe sleep deprivation and relentless stress. The trembling hand becomes a full-blown cognitive earthquake. This is exactly why we witness erratic, flip-flopping policies on the global stage. A national government might announce a massive, multi-billion-dollar subsidy for fossil fuels on a Monday to ease immediate pain at the pump, and then by Friday, pivot to a drastic, aggressive green energy mandate simply because a different set of advisors caught the leader in a different mood or a specific news cycle triggered a different emotional response.
The system itself is essentially having a panic attack. And speaking of world leaders and decision-making frameworks, this brings to mind a very specific approach that has been heavily debated in recent years. We've seen figures like Trump explicitly champion this concept of intuitive decision-making. And looking at this purely objectively, analyzing it as a structural framework for making choices, stripping away all the politics, it seems like a direct, albeit unconventional, response to this exact problem of institutional noise.
Analyzing that intuitive model through the strict lens of cognitive science yields a fascinating perspective. The intuitive decision-making model essentially acknowledges the core problem Kahneman identified. The spreadsheets are noisy, the intelligence briefings are filtered through bureaucratic bias, and the traditional expert systems are flawed.
So what's the response?
The response of the intuitive model is to completely abandon complex, multivariable calculations and revert entirely to instinct. The underlying logic is that if the institutional data is inevitably noisy, one might as well trust their gut feeling, which feels pure and unfiltered to the individual.
It's essentially bypassing the 55% variance of the underwriter by just guessing the premium based on a feeling.
Exactly. However, from a rigorous data science perspective, relying purely on intuition does not eliminate noise. It inherently introduces an even more volatile, concentrated form of unpredictability into global systems.
Because your gut feeling is also just biological noise.
Precisely. Intuition is, by its very biological definition, highly susceptible to momentary emotions, immediate physical surroundings, and recency bias, giving disproportionate weight to the very last thing you heard. So while an intuitive framework might successfully bypass slow, bureaucratic noise, it replaces it with a hyper-concentrated, singular point of noise at the very top of the decision tree. It removes the checks and balances that, while flawed, were designed to dampen extreme variance.
Which only exacerbates that ambient feeling of navigating a deeply unpredictable world. That hyper-concentrated noise at the top of the system inevitably trickles down to all of us. And when the general public feels the crushing weight of that unpredictability, when we were looking at 1973-style energy crises potentially repeating, and the news cycle is just a relentless barrage of stress, we don't write policy papers, we make memes.
We do. The cultural output shifts dramatically during periods of high volatility.
I am talking about the massive, inescapable flood of doomsday memes taking over the internet right now. You scroll through any social feed, and it is just endless jokes about lying flat, watching the world burn, and making light of economic collapse or global conflict. I look at this phenomenon and I have to wonder, is this a sign of collective societal collapse? Are we witnessing an entire generation just throwing their hands up and surrendering to nihilism? Or is there a deeper psychological mechanism operating beneath the surface of all these jokes?
It is incredibly tempting to view that dark humor as a symptom of societal surrender, but from a psychological standpoint, it is absolutely not a sign of collective collapse. In fact, it is the exact opposite.
Really?
Yes. What you are observing in this flood of doomsday memes is a highly sophisticated, deeply ingrained cognitive defense mechanism functioning exactly as it evolved to. There is a robust psychological framework that explains this phenomenon, known as the benign violation theory.
The benign violation theory. That sounds like something straight out of a behavioral science textbook. I was reading up on the mechanics of this, and it posits that humor only occurs when three specific, somewhat contradictory conditions are met simultaneously.
Right.
First, there must be a violation, something that fundamentally threatens your sense of how the world ought to be. This could be a direct physical threat, a severe breach of a social norm, or a massive, terrifying global event like an energy crisis, hyperinflation, or the threat of war, the normal order is violated.
That is the crucial first step. Without the violation, there is no tension to release.
Right. Then the second condition is that the situation must simultaneously be perceived as benign or safe in some specific way. It cannot be an immediate, active, lethal threat to the person in that exact second. And the third condition is the synthesis. These two contradictory perceptions, the severe threat and the layer of safety, must occur in the brain at the exact same time. The brain has to hold both concepts at once.
And that synthesis is what generates the laugh. When a real-world threat is simply too heavy, too complex, or too existential for our minds to process continuously, our cognitive system prevents a total mental crash by actively turning the threat into the absurd. It forces a psychological balance.
So it's basically a coping mechanism.
It is the ultimate coping mechanism. If an individual is constantly, relentlessly terrified of a global economic meltdown, their nervous system will eventually burn out from the sustained cortisol exposure. Therefore, the brain takes that extreme, valid anxiety and applies a layer of safe, benign mockery to it.
That makes so much sense.
When people share those doomsday memes, they are not making the joke because they are cold-blooded, apathetic, or genuinely desire the end of the world. They are making the joke because reality has expanded beyond what standard logic and emotional processing can handle. Humor is the brain's automatic pressure release valve.
So laughing at the apocalypse is actually our brain's evolutionary way of making sure we don't freeze in absolute terror. It keeps us mobile. To truly understand how deep this survival mechanism goes, we really need to look back at history. Because this is not just some internet-era phenomenon driven by social media algorithms. Human beings have actively weaponized dark humor in the absolute worst, most degrading circumstances imaginable.
If we expand our view to the broader picture of human history, arguably the most profound and thoroughly documented example of this comes from the work of Viktor Frankl. For listeners who might not be familiar, Viktor Frankl was a brilliant Austrian psychiatrist and philosopher who survived the horrors of the Holocaust.
His work is just incredible.
It is. He distilled his experiences into one of the most important psychological texts of the 20th century, Man's Search for Meaning. In that book, he details his daily existence in a Nazi concentration camp. And amidst the unimaginable starvation, brutality, and death, he describes a phenomenon that, to a comfortable outsider, seems completely impossible. They told jokes.
In a concentration camp.
Yeah.
The absolute darkest, most horrific, systematically dehumanizing environment ever created by mankind.
Yes. Frankl explicitly details how he and his fellow inmates would hold daily, deliberate contests to invent jokes. The subject matter of these jokes is what makes it so fascinating from a psychological perspective. They would specifically invent jokes about how incredibly awkward and absurd their social interactions would be after they were eventually released and returned to normal, polite society.
What kind of jokes?
They would vividly imagine sitting at a luxurious, high-society dinner party and accidentally asking the elegant hostess to serve the soup using the same brutal, desperate rationing methods they were subjected to in the camps.
It takes my breath away. Because to anyone who hasn't lived through that level of trauma, that might look like a break from reality. It might look like madness. How could you possibly joke about the very starvation that is actively killing the people around you?
Because looking at it through the lens of cognitive defense, it wasn't madness at all. It was the absolute pinnacle of sanity. It was a desperate, brilliant, and deeply psychological tactic to reclaim a shred of human agency.
Reclaiming agency through a joke.
Frankl explained the underlying philosophy. When a human being is stripped of absolutely every physical freedom, when you cannot change the objective, horrific tragedy of your physical environment, you still retain one ultimate, unassailable freedom. You retain the ability to choose your own attitude toward that suffering. You completely control the angle at which you view the tragedy.
The angle.
By deliberately crafting a joke about the camp's conditions, they were momentarily stepping outside of their immediate, crushing suffering and observing it from a higher vantage point. If you can still laugh at the absurdity of your oppressors and your environment, the environment has not completely crushed your soul. It is a profound declaration of spiritual and psychological independence.
You control the angle at which you view it. That reframes the entire concept of humor. It proves that dark humor is not just a passive reaction to bad things. It is an active survival tool. It is a way of looking the universe in the eye and saying, you might be inflicting unimaginable pain on my body, but you do not own my mind.
That is the exact mechanism. And modern psychologists, building on Frankel's observations, have identified 3 deep structural values of dark humor that apply seamlessly from the historical extremes of the 1940s right up to our current era of chaotic, volatile, global markets.
Let's go through those 3 values.
The first of these 3 values is that dark humor acts as a critical burnout preservative.
A burnout preservative, like an emotional formaldehyde to keep the brain from spoiling under stress. How does that manifest in practice today?
Consider the professionals who are required to operate daily in states of constant trauma, high stakes, and severe noise. Emergency room doctors, trauma surgeons, firefighters, frontline combat soldiers. If an ER doctor fully emotionally internalized the profound, life-shattering tragedy of every single terrible accident that was wheeled through their hospital doors, their amygdala, the brain's fear and emotional processing center would completely and catastrophically overload.
They wouldn't be able to function.
They would freeze in fear, or they would collapse from the sheer weight of cumulative grief. They physically would not be able to hold the scalpel steady. Therefore, they actively employ absurdity and exceedingly dark humor to deliberately create an emotional distance between themselves and the tragedy. It is not callousness, it is an occupational necessity. It prevents their executive functions from freezing, allowing them to rationally and effectively perform their life-saving duties.
That makes total sense when you lay out the biology of it. They aren't laughing at the victim on the table. They're laughing at the chaotic absurdity of the universe in order to protect their own sanity so they can actually do the job of saving the person. It is a functional emotional shield. What is the second deep value?
The second structural value is trench camaraderie. There's an incredibly exclusive, powerfully binding resonance that is formed by a shared joke in a terrible situation. When you are in the metaphorical trenches of a corporate crisis or the literal trenches of a conflict, and someone makes a dark, seemingly inappropriate joke, and you laugh, you are instantly communicating an immense amount of complex shared context.
You're saying, I get it.
You are silently telling the other person, I see the horror, you see the horror, and we both deeply understand exactly how ridiculous and unfair this situation is. It creates a psychological resonance that screams, we're in this together, in a way that sincere, polite words of comfort often completely fail to achieve. Sincerity can feel hollow in a crisis. A shared dark joke feels like truth.
Oh, I see this dynamic play out all the time in everyday life. It brings to mind a joke I saw circulating recently that perfectly captures this feeling of trench camaraderie right now. We all know that gas prices, particularly in places like California where the taxes and regulations add so much friction, have been absolutely punishing lately. And I saw someone post this incredibly dry joke. Gas is so expensive right now if I drive you home. That is not an act of friendship, that is a state distribution.
That is a textbook example of trench camaraderie operating at a societal level.
Right. When I read that, I completely burst out laughing. And then I immediately forwarded it to 5 of my friends, and they all responded with laughing emojis. Now, sending that meme didn't solve the macroeconomic energy crisis. The supply chains are still a mess, gas was still painfully expensive, but in that brief shared moment, we felt connected. We were all experiencing the exact same financial fiction, but the joke made us feel like we were a unified team enduring the absurdity together, rather than isolated, anxious individuals panicking alone about our bank accounts. It changed the texture of the stress.
It absolutely changes the texture. And that specific joke also perfectly illustrates the third deep value of dark humor, which is reshaping power dynamics.
Reshaping power dynamics. How does a quick joke about California gas prices reshape power?
When you actively mock a threat, you fundamentally alter your psychological relationship to it. Whether that external threat is the concept of death, a tyrannical political dictator, or crushing systemic inflation, the threat's primary weapon against your psyche is fear. It relies on making you feel small, powerless, and reactive. It wants you to cower.
It feeds on the fear.
Exactly. When you deploy humor to laugh at it, you spiritually and psychologically elevate yourself above the threat. You are essentially taking the terrifying monster hiding under the bed, dragging it into the light, and loudly pointing out that the monster is wearing ridiculous, oversized polka dot socks. The monster is objectively still in the room. The threat has not vanished, but it no longer holds the same paralyzing, majestic power over your nervous system. You have demeaned it.
You are shrinking the monster down to a manageable size. I absolutely love that visual. But I imagine, given how much we've talked about the brain, there is hard empirical science backing this up, right? This cannot just be a philosophical theory about coping. Our biology must actually physically react to the introduction of humor in these high-stress moments.
The empirical research validating this phenomenon is incredibly robust. Humor is not just a soft psychological concept. It is essentially a hard chemical hack for our fear circuits. Let's look at the specific data. Researchers at Stanford University conducted a fascinating, highly technical study where they placed human subjects inside an fMRI machine.
Okay, scanning their brains.
Yes. For those unfamiliar, functional magnetic resonance imaging scans the brain's activity and blood flow in real time. They established a baseline by showing the subjects a rapid series of deeply negative, distressing, and threatening images. Predictably, the monitors showed the subjects' amygdalas lighting up like a Christmas tree, signaling a massive spike in high stress and acute fear.
The brain's primitive panic button was being mashed repeatedly by the visual stimuli.
Precisely. The fear response was functioning perfectly. But then, the researchers introduced the variable. They instructed the subjects to actively try and reframe the negative images they were seeing by inventing a humorous, absurd, or darkly comedic twist to the visual narrative.
What happened?
The moment the subjects cognitively engaged in the act of finding the humor, the fMRI scanners revealed something incredible. The amygdalas actively began powering down. The fear center was being physically, measurably suppressed by the higher-level act of cognitive reframing. The humor literally forced the brain's neurochemistry to stop panicking.
That is a staggering finding. So it is not just a subjective feeling of relief. It is a measurable physiological shutdown of the fear response. The joke acts like an emergency brake on the amygdala.
Yes. And while the Stanford study proved the immediate, real-time chemical effect, other studies have tracked the long-term, compounding benefits, and those results are even more striking.
Which studies?
The Journal of Loss and Trauma published a profound longitudinal study examining the rescue workers and first responders who operated at Ground Zero following the 9/11 attacks in New York. We are talking about individuals who were exposed to the absolute apex of unimaginable human tragedy, physical danger, and sustained psychological stress.
The highest possible stress environment.
Absolutely. The researchers meticulously tracked the psychological well-being and PTSD markers of these workers over an extended period. The data revealed that the rescue workers who naturally and consistently utilized dark humor as a coping mechanism during and immediately after the event had psychological recovery scores that were a full 30% higher a year later compared to their peers who did not use humor.
A 30% higher recovery score just from utilizing humor as a processing tool. That emphatically proves that a joke is not just a temporary band-aid to get through a bad shift. It is actual potent emotional medicine. It actively builds long-term psychological resilience against PTSD.
It does. It is a critical survival tool. However, we have to return to the underlying mechanics of the benign violation theory to understand exactly why it works, and much more importantly, when it fails catastrophically.
Right, because dark humor definitely can fail.
The University of Colorado operates an entire department dedicated to this, the Humor Research Lab, famously known by the excellent acronym HRL. They extensively study the incredibly delicate balance between the violation the threat and the benign the safety. Their research concluded that whether a dark joke lands as a hilarious, tension-relieving triumph or as a deeply offensive, relationship-destroying disaster depends almost entirely on one factor.
What's the factor?
Psychological distance. That distance can be measured in time, in geographical space, or in personal emotional attachment to the tragedy.
That perfectly aligns with the old cultural adage that tragedy plus time equals comedy. You need that temporal distance to create the benign layer.
Exactly. If the violation is too severe, or if the psychological distance is too close, for example, making a joke about a horrific car accident while you and the other person are still physically trapped inside the mangled wreckage, the brain simply cannot locate the benign safety element. The threat is too immediate.
Right, there's nothing benign about that.
In that scenario, it is not a joke, it is just a violation. It is just compounding the trauma. But if there's enough distance, the joke successfully creates a cognitive bridge over the trauma. However, this scientific reality brings us to a crucial, unyielding moral boundary that we must address when discussing dark humor. It is a phenomenally powerful tool, but it is a highly dangerous one if mishandled.
I think we have all been in a room or read a post online where someone attempts a dark joke that aggressively crosses that invisible line, and the entire atmosphere just instantly goes ice cold. The tension doesn't release, it spikes. Where exactly is that boundary drawn in the framework of all this psychology?
The boundary is not drawn by the subject matter itself, but by power dynamics and positional authority. Let me state this as clearly and grounded as possible. Dark humor is a victim sanctuary, not a bystander's weapon.
A victim sanctuary, not a bystander's weapon. That is a profound distinction. It gives me chills just hearing it phrased that way.
It is the absolute defining rule of the entire concept. When the people who are actively enduring the suffering utilize humor to mock their own pain, it is an act of profound courage and resilience. It is Viktor Frankl generating jokes about soup rations in the depths of a camp. It is the terminal patient in the oncology ward making a morbid joke about their own diagnosis to comfort their family.
Well, when someone else does it.
When a comfortable, insulated bystander, someone who bears zero personal risk and is safely distanced from the tragedy, makes a joke mocking the people who are actively suffering. That is not humor. That is cruelty. That is the definition of punching down. We must never confuse the courage of the victim with the callousness of the bystander.
That is such a vital, humanizing distinction to make. We can laugh to survive the battles we are fighting ourselves, but we possess absolutely no right to weaponize humor to belittle someone else's war. It ceases to be a defense mechanism and becomes an attack.
Furthermore, there is a secondary, highly insidious danger to dark humor that we must warn against, even when it is used correctly by the people in the trenches. You must actively guard against allowing the humor to curdle into sheer nihilism.
Right, when it just becomes an excuse to stop caring.
As we establish, humor is a temporary psychological tourniquet. It effectively stops the emotional bleeding when the pressure of the crisis is simply too high. It grants you a moment to breathe and stabilize. But eventually you cannot just sit in the emergency room making clever jokes forever.
You have to actually treat the patient.
Eventually you have to take the tourniquet off, objectively assess the wound, and do the hard, unglamorous work of fixing the actual problem. If you rely on doomsday memes to the point where you completely stop caring, where your default response to any crisis is a cynical, nothing matters anyway, the humor has stopped being a protective shield and has metastasized into a cognitive poison. It becomes an excuse for inaction.
So the humor buys us the vital time and the baseline sanity required to formulate a real, actionable plan, which serves as the perfect transition into the final and most practical phase of our discussion today. Because if the world is currently saturated with noisy data and we are utilizing dark humor to keep our amygdalas from panicking, how do we actually move forward?
Yes, how do we take action?
How do we make good, rational decisions when everything feels volatile? How do we take the tourniquet off and fix the problem? This is where I want to bring up a real-life story about a mutual friend of ours, Mickey, because his experience perfectly illustrates the solution.
Mickey. His recent situation is truly the perfect micro-level case study for everything we are discussing today regarding noise and decision-making.
It really is. For our listeners who don't know him, Mickey is a fantastic guy. He is an intensely logic-driven, analytical person. He works in the tech sector. He loves building complex spreadsheets. He naturally thinks in flowcharts and algorithms. But a few months ago, Mickey found himself caught up in the one human experience that reliably defies all logic and destroys all rational frameworks: romantic confusion.
The ultimate undefeated destroyer of rational thought and executive function.
Exactly. Mickey had developed a massive, all-consuming crush on a classmate of his. And because he is an analytical guy, he was entirely consumed by trying to parse the data of their interactions. He was agonizing over the timestamps on her text messages, analyzing the subtle inflections in her voice, completely stressed out, trying to definitively figure out if she liked him back.
He was trying to find a pattern in the noise.
He was an absolute cognitive mess. He was convincing himself that a one-word text reply wasn't a sign of disinterest, but rather a sign that she was highly efficient and respectful of his time.
What Mickey was experiencing on a personal level is the exact same biological mechanism that paralyzes policymakers in a global crisis. His amygdala was completely overloaded with intense emotion in his specific case, a potent cocktail of deep infatuation and the paralyzing panic of potential rejection.
Right.
When the emotional center of the brain is running that hot, it acts like a physiological override. The prefrontal cortex, which is the region responsible for logic, objective reasoning, and pattern recognition, gets entirely bypassed. The biological reality is that you literally cannot think straight. The noise is deafening. So to break the cycle, Mickey had to utilize a highly effective behavioral technique that cognitive scientists refer to as offloading cognition.
Offloading cognition. It sounds like freeing up RAM on a computer. How exactly does a person execute that in the middle of an emotional spiral?
The premise is simple but profound. When your brain is overloaded with emotional noise, you cannot reliably process data internally. The internal environment is compromised. Therefore, you have to force a physical, mechanical cool down by outsourcing your brain's processing power to the external world. Specifically, you outsource it to a piece of paper.
Just writing it down.
You have to physically write the variables down. The magic of paper is that paper does not have an amygdala. Paper does not feel the sting of rejection. Paper does not care about global oil prices. By forcing the chaotic data out of your head and organizing it onto a physical page, you force your brain to slow its processing speed, which naturally re-engages the logical, analytical prefrontal cortex.
And Mickey desperately needed that external processor because his brain was actively engaging in something we are all incredibly guilty of when we want a specific outcome. He was deeply trapped in a massive confirmation bias loop.
Yes, the sniper rifle was aiming wildly to the left. Confirmation bias is our brain's relentless evolutionary tendency to aggressively search for, interpret, and selectively remember information in a way that strictly confirms our pre-existing desires or deeply held beliefs, while simultaneously, almost invisibly, filtering out any evidence to the contrary.
And Mickey's brain was working overtime to maintain that illusion. If we looked at his romantic situation objectively as outside observers, the board was covered in massive red flags. She routinely did not text him back for days at a time. When she finally did reply, she gave flat one-word answers. She never once initiated a conversation or suggested hanging out.
Pure counter-evidence.
But Mickey's brain literally filtered all of that overwhelming negative signal out and dumped it into the cognitive trash folder. Instead, his brain took a massive fluorescent highlighter to the tiniest, most insignificant positive signals. He would say things like, "She smiled at me when I handed her the syllabus on Tuesday. She chose a seat relatively near me in the lecture hall." His brain was constructing a completely false, highly optimistic narrative out of pure, random noise.
Which is precisely why the physical act of offloading cognition was so critical for his well-being. Mickey, ultimately being the analytical guy he is, eventually realized his internal intuition was severely compromised. He recognized the trembling hand.
Oh.
So he sat down at his desk with a blank piece of paper and created what we can affectionately call the classmate friend checklist.
He ruthlessly broke his chaotic romantic situation down into 3 specific sterile dimensions. And this 3-part structure, by the way, forms the ultimate decision hygiene checklist that can be successfully applied to almost any complex scenario in life.
Let's break down Mickey's 3 dimensions, because the architecture of this checklist is brilliant. The first dimension he wrote down was the fact.
The fact.
The rule here is that you must state the observable reality of the situation without using any emotional adjectives or subjective interpretations. For Mickey, the objective fact was, she sits next to me in class, and we chat during the lecture. That is an indisputable, observable reality that a camera in the room would record.
That is the crucial first step. You isolate the raw, uninterpreted data. No assumptions about her feelings, just the physical reality, right? Step 1 is just the raw data. Then we move to the second dimension, which is counter-evidence.
This is the hard part.
This is where the checklist gets uncomfortable, because this is where you actively play devil's advocate against your own deepest desires. You force your brain to actively look for the data it has been subconsciously trying to hide. Mickey had to write down the question, does she ever reply to my messages outside of the physical classroom environment?
Yeah, and what was the answer?
When he actually looked at the timestamp data on his phone, stripping away his excuses about her being busy, the objective, undeniable result was simply, no, she does not.
That dimension is essentially a targeted strike against confirmation bias.
Wow.
It forces the prefrontal cortex to acknowledge the discarded data.
It is like throwing cold water on your own face. And finally, the third dimension is motivation. This step requires you to isolate the variables to understand the true underlying driver of the behavior. You have to remove the context.
How did he frame that?
Mickey asked himself, if this specific class did not exist, if we were not forced into this geographical proximity by the university registrar, would we have any interaction whatsoever? And the harsh, honest, undeniable result was no.
The conclusion generated by the checklist is objectively brutal, but it provides absolute clarity. The data proves she wasn't harboring a secret, shy infatuation. She was simply being polite to a fellow human being in a confined space.
Right.
And honestly, while forcing himself to physically write out that checklist probably stung his ego in the moment, it saved Mickey from months of agonizing over silent text threads, expending massive amounts of emotional energy, and ultimately facing a much deeper, more painful heartbreak down the line. The physical checklist forced him to stare directly at the reality his amygdala was desperately trying to obscure.
It was an absolute triumph of decision hygiene. And what I find so fascinating and so empowering about this framework is that the exact same mechanical process that saved Mickey's weekend from an emotional spiral can save a retail investor's retirement portfolio or a CEO's company during a supply chain crisis. We can scale this simple 3-part checklist from a university romance straight up to navigating global geopolitical chaos.
The scalability of the framework is its greatest strength. Applying this to the broader world requires executing 3 distinct steps to actively filter the noise out of your daily life and the relentless global news cycle.
Okay, let's walk through the 3 steps. What's step 1?
Step 1 is decomposition. You have to take a massive, overwhelming feeling and break it down into observable, isolated variables. When you hear a pundit screaming that the market is crashing and the economy is doomed, you have to recognize that is a feeling, not a fact. It is too massive to process.
So you have to break it down.
You must decompose it. Ask the specific questions. What specific sector is actually experiencing the downturn? Is the friction caused by a temporary supply bottleneck, or is it a structural demand destruction? You isolate the components.
Which perfectly mirrors Mickey isolating the specific classroom environment from the rest of his life. You break the terrifying monster down into manageable pieces you can actually analyze. What is step 2 of scaling this?
Step 2 is to reduce emotional weight. Put it on paper, just as Mickey did. As we established, paper does not panic. If you are staring at a flashing bright red stock ticker on a dual monitor setup, your biological heart rate is literally tethered to those shifting pixels. The interface is designed to provoke an emotional response.
It's built to stress you out.
Exactly. To break the hijack, you write the specific numbers down on a physical analog notepad, physically close the laptop, and walk into an entirely different room. By doing that, you have successfully severed the raw data from the digital noise machine that is algorithmically designed to keep you in a state of high anxiety.
Unplugging from the matrix to let the prefrontal cortex reboot. I absolutely love that actionable advice. And step 3?
Step 3 is pattern recognition. Just as Mickey analyzed the data and realized the university class was the sole variable driving the interaction with his crush, citizens and investors must hunt for the actual fundamental variables affecting the world rather than succumbing to the ambient panic.
How does that look in practice?
If you see the price of oil spike dramatically, do not immediately surrender to generalized anxiety about hyperinflation. Hunt for the underlying pattern. Is the price spike caused by a localized acute event, like a temporary tanker blockage in the Strait of Hormuz? Or is it indicative of a massive systemic failure of global production infrastructure? You must isolate the true variable to make an informed decision.
This framework is so incredibly practical, and we can deploy this checklist concept for so many mundane, everyday things that cause us low-level chronic anxiety. I actually have a few playful, personal checklists I've started maintaining based entirely on Mickey's logic because, let's face it, our brains are messy, noisy places.
Applying clinical frameworks to everyday life is the best way to build a habit. I'm very curious to hear how you are implementing this.
Okay, here is one I rely on constantly. I call it the gym friend checklist. We all have those specific people we see at the gym every Tuesday. We chat by the water cooler. We spot each other on the bench press. We feel like we are basically best buddies.
Right, the gym buddy.
But here is the ruthless checklist application. If you bump into that exact same person in the produce aisle of the grocery store outside of the gym environment, do they actually remember your name? Do they stop to talk? If the answer is no, they aren't actually a friend. They are simply a gym accessory. They are just a highly interactive part of the facility's equipment.
That is painfully accurate and a perfect application of the framework. You successfully isolated the environmental variable exactly like Mickey isolating the classroom.
Yeah.
You stripped away the context to find the truth of the relationship.
Exactly. It prevents me from over-investing in casual acquaintances. Here's another one that has genuinely saved me thousands of dollars. The impulse shopping checklist. You are browsing online late at night, your brain is tired, you see a shiny new gadget or an expensive jacket, and you feel this overwhelming biological urge that you absolutely must own it right this second.
A very common noise loop.
The checklist rule is, put the item in the digital cart, but leave it there and close the browser. If 24 full hours pass and you cannot remember the specific name or brand of the item sitting in that cart without opening the app to check, it was never a necessity. It was just a temporary dopamine spike. It was pure, unfiltered noise.
That is a phenomenal, highly practical example of offloading cognition and utilizing temporal distance to kill the noise. The immediate emotional heat of the dopamine spike fades over the 24 hours, and the rational executive brain takes back control of your wallet.
It works every single time. And let's bring it all the way back to the heavy macroeconomic stuff we started the show with, the energy analysis checklist. If you wake up, look at the news, and see that crude oil has jumped 30%, and your immediate knee-jerk instinct is to open social media to see what angry pundits are saying about it, rather than seeking out actual, boring, global inventory data, you aren't investing. You aren't analyzing the market. You are just buying into the collective panic. You are actively seeking out the noise to validate your anxiety.
That is perhaps the most critical realization a person can have in the modern information ecosystem. And acknowledging that leads us to a very harsh, unvarnished truth about practicing decision hygiene. The reality is, rigorously using these checklists can sometimes feel slightly depressing in the immediate aftermath.
Which makes complete sense when you think about the mechanics of it, because you are essentially forcing yourself to look at the uncomfortable truths your brain actively evolved to hide from you. You are aggressively killing your own cheap optimism.
Exactly. Checklists aggressively strip away the comforting, low-resolution illusions our brains construct to protect our egos and soothe our anxieties. Mickey had to face the cold fact that his crush simply did not like him. The late-night impulse shopper has to face the uncomfortable fact that buying a $300 jacket will not fundamentally fix the fact that they had a bad day at work.
The truth hurts.
It does. The retail investor has to face the daunting fact that there is no secret, magic bullet to instantly understand the global economy. But operating in the complex environment of 2026, objective truth is infinitely more valuable and infinitely safer than a comforting lie.
It is the cognitive equivalent of eating your vegetables. It's not always a thrilling dopamine hit in the moment, but it builds the structural integrity you need to survive.
It is mandatory for survival. We live in an era where you simply cannot blindly trust your unguided instincts anymore. Human instincts evolved over millennia to keep us safe from immediate physical predators in the jungle. They absolutely did not evolve to accurately process high-frequency algorithmic trading data, complex geopolitical shifts, or highly curated, hyper-targeted social media feeds.
That is such a good point. We are operating outside our evolutionary programming.
Yes, your basic instincts are actively being fine-tuned and aggressively manipulated by algorithms designed by some of the smartest software engineers on the planet, all with the explicit goal of keeping you angry, anxious, and endlessly engaged. The checklist is your only tangible defense against the algorithm.
So what we are really saying here, fundamentally, is that taking 5 minutes to physically write down the objective facts, actively hunt for the counter-evidence, and isolate the true motivations is not just a productivity hack. It is an active act of rebellion. You are taking back the steering wheel of your own mind.
It is the ultimate cognitive defense mechanism available to us.
What an incredible journey we have been on today. Let's try to pull all of these massive concepts together for our listeners before we head out. We have covered an immense amount of ground. We started by clearly defining the critical difference between bias and noise bias, being the misaligned sniper sight that pulls everyone in the same wrong direction, and noise being the trembling hand that scatters our judgment randomly and unpredictably.
We learned that this dangerous noise exists everywhere in human systems.
Right, from our fluctuating morning moods to the staggering 55% variance in professional insurance underwriters, all the way up to veteran judges handing down vastly different prison sentences based entirely on what time they ate lunch.
And we explored how that exact same human noise is exponentially amplified on the world stage during a crisis, generating the chaotic, flip-flopping policy shifts that make the world feel so unstable.
Exactly. And because that ambient chaos is so heavy, we instinctively turn to dark humor to cope. We broke down the benign violation theory, learning how turning a terrifying reality into an absurd joke is actually our brain's brilliant evolutionary method for cooling down an overheated amygdala. We looked at the profound lessons from Viktor Frankl in the darkest places on Earth, proving that humor is a vital tool to reclaim human agency.
It preserves frontline workers from emotional burnout, and it builds deep camaraderie in the trenches. But we also established the firm ethical boundary. Humor must permanently remain the sanctuary of the victim and never be wielded as the weapon of the bystander. And crucially, that humor must eventually give way to rational action.
Which brings us to the ultimate action plan, decision hygiene, the Mickey method, taking the time to offload your overloaded, anxious brain onto a sterile piece of paper, decomposing the massive problems, reducing the emotional weight by stepping away from the screen, and searching for the true underlying patterns. So the biggest, most actionable takeaway for you, the listener, today is this. Practice your decision hygiene rigorously.
Make it a habit.
Make it an unbreakable rule in your life to never, ever make major financial, professional, or relationship decisions when you are highly emotional, sleep-deprived, or hungry. Stop the noise before it takes root in your life.
That is an excellent comprehensive summary of our exploration today.
Now, before we officially wrap up the show, I want to clearly state an objective reminder for everyone tuning in. The primary goal of our discussion today is purely to foster independent, critical thinking and provide analytical frameworks. We objectively report on psychological concepts and data structures. We absolutely do not criticize, endorse, or discriminate against any specific nation, political group, or demographic. And importantly, any financial scenarios, market concepts, or energy pricing discussed today are purely for data reference and educational illustration. We are not financial advisors, so please always do your own thorough research.
It is always essential to keep our own biases and assumptions completely in check. And as we close out our time together, I want to leave you with a final, somewhat provocative thought to mull over in the days ahead.
I am ready.
We just spent all this time talking about the relentless noise in the outside world, the chaotic data filtering through your screens, the manipulative algorithms, the geopolitical panic. But consider this flipped perspective. If our brains naturally evolved to filter out uncomfortable facts to protect our fragile feelings, exactly as we saw with the mechanics of confirmation bias, and if the digital algorithms are perfectly designed to feed us exactly what we want to hear to keep us comfortable and engaged, what if the biggest, most dangerous source of noise in your life right now is not the shouting on the internet, but actually the absolute silence of the hard truths you are actively choosing to ignore? What is the one specific checklist you are terrified to write down tonight?
Oh, that is incredibly heavy. The silence of the truths you are actively ignoring. That thought is going to be rattling around in my prefrontal cortex all week long. What a staggeringly powerful note to end on. Thank you all so much for spending your valuable time with us today. We genuinely hope this conversation gives you some tangible tools to cut through the chaos of the world right now. Please do not forget to subscribe to Sip&Talk wherever you listen so you never miss a discussion. And hey, a very special shout out to our good friend Mickey, who inspired our entire checklist segment today. Make sure you go subscribe to Mickey's YouTube channel, Mickey to Life. He has some amazing, beautifully shot new travel vlogs up right now, and you definitely want to check them out. Thank you again. Stay curious, practice your decision hygiene, and we will see you next time.
Take care of yourselves and each other.